So good day everybody. We're dealing with sort of a summary of actually the overall Reformation, especially in the first 3 or 4 decades from 1517 when Martin Luther originally sort of put up his thesis in relation, the 95 Theses in relation to indulgences. At that stage he was mainly concerned about the corruption that he's seen, the corrupt practices within the actual church, especially in regard to indulgences. But as the next couple of years goes on, he gets into various debates in 1518, 1519 with various different church authorities and bishops, and these theological debates develop Luther's ideas more deeply than before, and he begins to challenge not just the practices of the church, but the actual very doctrine itself of the church. And he begins to believe that most of the sacraments are unnecessary, and he puts tremendous emphasis on faith alone in a book he writes in 1520 in relation to, it's called The Freedom of the Christian, and that book places tremendous emphasis on the whole idea of faith. It's as if he comes to believe that there's nothing else necessary, only faith, and that faith is imputed to the believer and they can never lose their faith and all that type of thing. John Calvin develops that idea into total depravity and predestination, all that sort of stuff later on in the 30s and 40s. But in the early stages, Luther is mainly objecting to the idea of people paying for indulgences, and it develops into something more complex over the following years as he writes these various books, and he gathers a tremendous following behind him. One of the books he writes, of course, in 1520, just to recap on this, is he invites the German nobility to get involved in reforming the church, and this, to a certain extent, is a monumental mistake, because whereas Luther intends the nobility to get involved in reforming the church, he invites the nobility to get involved in church affairs in their own particular regions, in their own territories. And of course they do, but not so much for the reason that Luther actually envisaged. They get involved because they recognize that the church is an extremely wealthy organization that owns between 20 and 25% of the land of Europe in most countries. So there's a very strong incentive to get involved from that point of view, and also because they want to undermine the power of the Roman Empire. Various different taxes and various different church fees and one thing and another, revenue streams of one type or another are moving towards Rome, to the centre of the empire. And there's very many the early birth of European nationalism is emerging at this time as well, especially in countries like England, where King Henry VIII is aware that the royal house in England had attempted to break free of the Roman Empire earlier and free of the Pope as well a couple of centuries earlier. And therefore the nobility are very happy to accept Luther's invitation to get involved in reform of the church, because it's not so much that they altogether share. Some of them, of course, do share his theology. In fairness, some of them are actually genuinely. Luther's a very persuasive talker and a very persuasive writer, and he does appear to actually have a very strong case in terms of recovering the faith, etc. But the idea of faith alone he carries too far. He also carries his whole anger towards the papacy. He's thrown out of the church, of course, in 21, 4 years after he puts up the 95 Theses. He's expelled from the church in January 21, and he never seems to get over that. He's excommunicated by the Pope. So during the course of the 20s, of course, there's quite a lot of chaos in Germany, and not just Germany, of course. There's quite a lot of chaos, and especially in Switzerland as well, and its impact in various other countries as well, because Luther's writings have spread around all over the place at this stage. And in Germany, of course, the Peasants Revolt cost the lives of 70,000 people, and in Switzerland you have another even more radical reformer in the shape of Zwingli, who wants to involve the state in reforming the entire Christian religion, and he also rejects the whole idea of the Eucharist. And Luther runs into a massive conflict with him by the late 20s and 29 in Malberg Castle. the two men meet, but they don't agree because they have two different concepts completely of the Eucharist. But actually, Luther would also have a different idea to Zwingli in terms of Luther is more idealistic, he's also more moderate. He believes that by making the Bible available to everyone, that there will be an automatic unity around the Bible itself and around the ideas of the Bible. But he's wrong about that, because actually the Bible can be interpreted in a whole lot of different ways, different passages. And there's very clear evidence of that today, because America, where the whole doctrine of Scripture alone is given full freedom. In America, there's 20,000 or 30,000 different denominations, and that's caused by the fact that the Bible is open to so many different interpretations and so many different aspects of it that can be emphasized by a particular preacher, and in some cases the preacher goes on to found his own church. That happened in the event of the Mormons, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the various different Jehovah's Witnesses, and apart from several preachers. So this Scripture alone theory that Martin Luther developed in a very idealistic way, he thought that actually this would actually do a tremendous amount of good, and the whole Christian community would unite around, in harmony, around the single message of the gospel. But that's not actually what happened. The actual authority of the church was undermined by the Reformation. As a result of that, undermining the authority of the church, it basically opened up Christendom to a lot of chaos. And these various different nobles moved in then in different territories, and they actually imposed their concept of what was the correct faith on their territory. People, by and large, had little or no say on it. England is an example I'm quite familiar with. England changed from being a Catholic country to being a Reformed country or Protestant country over a 40 or 50 year period. By the King Henry VIII in the mid-30s, in 34, he recognised that there was an opportunity to break free from Rome. He'd be able to manage to get a divorce by instructing his own archbishop in that direction, and he was also able to take over the church land and to actually achieve a greater degree of independence from Rome and from the Pope than England had ever experienced before. So this is a great opportunity from King Henry VIII's point of view to actually increase his own power, increase his own wealth, and at the same time impose himself as the leader of the church. So the actual nobles of Europe had a different construct in mind in relation to how they would adapt the Reformation in their own particular territories. And Luther's, to a large extent, he lost control of the nobles. He lost control of the situation in the various different territories. They didn't come in to reform. They didn't get involved to reform the church. They got involved mainly to actually achieve a greater degree of national independence from the Roman Empire, also to have greater control over church finances and have the finances coming into their own particular exchequers in some cases, or contained within the church of their own country. And they also got involved because of the colossal amount of land. There was 20 or 25% of land that was owned by the church in the 1500s, in the early 1500s. So the nobles of Europe actually had their own sort of material interest, their own, in some cases, selfish motivation. Whether they shared Luther's theology or not was irrelevant. They had a very strong vested interest in becoming involved, and that's what they've done. Like, for instance, if you look at the actual the situation in England, in 1534, King Henry VIII managed to push through the Act of Supremacy. A lot of opposition, actually, a lot of very genuine Christians like Thomas More, John Fisher, and people like that didn't go along with this and were executed as a result. So there was a lot of genuine Christians on both sides who were very reluctant to see the state taking over the role of the Pope and imposing a particular form of religion. Thomas More in particular was very conscious of that. He recognised that no politician, no ruler, no lay ruler should be running a church in any country. And he recognised that, and he gave his life for it, because he recognised that the whole idea of politics, which is very often corrupt, and especially at the higher level of politics, the nobility and that, for them to be running the church was a recipe for disaster, and that proved to be the case in many countries in subsequent years. So that's why Thomas More rejected the whole idea of Henry VIII becoming King of England. But although Henry VIII became leader of the church, he didn't ever share Martin Luther's particular theology. I mean, he brought about, in order to stabilise the English state in the late 30s, in 1539, King Henry VIII instituted or brought about what's called the 6 Articles. And those 6 Articles are extremely pro-Catholic in every way. They actually support the whole idea of the Mass, they support transubstantiation, they support unmarried clergy, they support the whole idea of confession and prayers and pilgrimages. It's virtually totally actually pro-Catholic. The only thing that Henry VIII wanted was he wanted a divorce. He wanted Rome to have less authority over church affairs in England, and he wanted to enrich himself. And he achieved all those 3 objectives without sharing Martin Luther's obsession with faith alone. So Henry VIII was very much a Catholic all his life. He went to Mass, received all that all his life. He died in 47. It was only after that the nobles in the royal house in England, actually, many of them were beneficiaries of the King Henry VIII sell-off of cheap land. So they wanted to actually make sure to consolidate the Reformation in England especially. And in order to do so, they brought about, the king that replaced Henry VIII was his son, Edward VI. But he was only a child of 9 years of age. And the person who was basically the prime minister, they're called regents at that time, but John Dudley, and there was another guy, I can't think of his name, but anyway, they were the most senior people with executive power within the British establishment. And they instituted a lot of reforms of a Protestant nature in the reign of King Edward VI, who was only a child. He was 9 years of age when he took over the crown, and he was only 15 in 53. He was there from 47. Henry died in 47, and his son was there for 6 years, from 47 to 1553. So that's what happened in England. It was a very gradualistic type of change. It took 20, 30, 40 years to actually bring about a change that substantially moved the country from being a Catholic country to being a Protestant country. And the key point is that the ordinary people had no say whatever in this. The people didn't sit down and do a Bible study and say, I want to be a Protestant or anything like that. That's not what happened. The actual religion was enforced on people, and they had no choice in the matter. And in Europe, the same thing happened. Loads of people became martyrs, either for the Reformed faith or for the Catholic faith. And this is one of the great tragedies, that when the authority of the church was completely undermined by the Reformation, chaos erupted, and in the process of lay rulers in various countries filling that power vacuum, there was all sorts of conflicts within cities, within towns, and between countries and territories in Europe. As a result, millions of people lost their lives. And this is the point that I want to make, that Luther really, there was a lot of things that happened that Luther was the inspiration for, but he didn't really have control of. He wouldn't have foreseen. And in his life, Martin Luther actually was talking to some major theologian, and he actually agreed that he didn't really have much control over most of the events that happened. And a number of years later, of course, he died in 46. It was King Henry VIII died in 47. But a few years later, in 1555, the rulers of Europe decided a peace treaty whereby the ruler of each territory would be allowed to impose his own particular, or her own particular brand of religion onto that territory. So this was to a large extent very different to what Luther had imagined when he wrote the book, The Freedom of the Christian, in 1520. So that's it for today. This is a summary of the Reformation, the first 2 or 3 decades. I hope to actually do some work on the Counter-Reformation, which is the Catholic Church's response, in a week or two. So if you want to join, subscribe, please do so, and you can see the actual Catholic response next week in relation to all these events It's called the Counter Reformation. So thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.